Welcome to No Rares Required, Episode 20, Selesnya Toxic Aggro. Every week I discuss a drafting strategy for a different archetype, and today we will be covering my strategy for drafting Selesnya, or green-white, in Phyrexia All Will Be One. Early on, I think Selesnya was considered to be one of the best archetypes because it was aggressive, and you could win either through dealing damage or bringing your opponent to 10 poison counters. As we come to the final week before March of the Machines, it lies in the middle of the pack as far as how often the archetype is being drafted. And its win rate on 17 lands is pretty close to average. Despite it not being a heavily drafted archetype, it was one of the archetypes that I drafted the least because the cards I wanted to include tend to be heavily sought after for other archetypes. Selesnya's theme on Arena is Toxic Aggro, which is on point. You want cheap, toxic, aggressive creatures, and unlike some other archetypes, this one is pretty straightforward, so let's begin. Contagious Vorak is my only Tier 1 common. I put it at Tier S in Gruul because getting to your 4 and 5 drops is very important for that archetype. In Selesnya, the Proliferate really comes into play, and often it is not wrong to just send it all to the bottom to trigger Proliferate, depending on how low your curve is. In the set, you want to have early creatures, but I've found that if I build a hyper-aggressive deck with 3 or less 4-cost creatures, then and nothing on a higher CMC, the deck kind of fizzles out. So it's a bit of a balancing act, and Contagious Vorak helps you navigate that balancing act. Did you end up drawing your late game early? Then grab a land. Are you already smacking your opponent for Toxic by turn 3? Then proliferate. The versatility of Vorak is great, but this is not new news. This card goes early for a common around pick 3 or 4, and I want as many as I can get. My next 4 Tier 2 commons are all white. First up, we have Basilica Shepherd. I've mentioned this card in every archetype with white, and it is one of the best 5-drops in the set. Essentially a 5/5 worth of stats for 5, where 3/3 of it has flying. The 3 double pip white wants 10 sources of white to reliably cast it on turn 5, but with how many great commons and uncommons white has to offer, my decks tend to be mostly white in Selesnya. And green is more of a secondary color since most of its power lies at the uncommon level. People have started to pick this up a little earlier, around 4 or 5, but for good reason. This is the best option at common for your late game, and I'll happily run 3 or 4. Next up we have Flincing Raptor, also at Tier 2. And a distinction I'd like to point out between Selesnya and Orzhov, or White-Black. In Orzhov, I'd take Crawling Chorus, the 1/1 toxic that spawns a 1/1 might when it dies, over Flincing Raptor. Like, to the point I've moved Crawling Chorus up to Tier S in Orzhov. But in Selesnya, I'd rather pick up Flincing Raptor. Why? In Orzhov, it is more important to get your opponent corrupted. And so a turn 1 toxic creature is very, very important. In Selesnya, I think it is best to try to win through damage and have toxic as a secondary win condition. Therefore, evasion becomes more important, and you'll see that cards like Hexgold Hoverwings perform better in Selesnya than Orzhov as well. In Orzhov, Flincing Raptor is best to get your early toxic creature through to pop them up to 3 poison counters, while in Selesnya it's more about the flying and having some toxic icing on top. This card is also highly sought after and is usually gone around pick 3 or 4. Indoctrination Attendant is also starting to see some more love. People have learned that it feels so good to bounce something back that got hit by an enchantment removal like Planar Disruption or Mesmerizing Dose. I've also found it useful late in the game to bounce the land that was tapped to bring this in if you didn't have a land to play for that turn. I do think people get tempted into doing things like bouncing Basilica Shepherd that have good enter the battlefield effects, but especially in Selesnya, you want to make sure this doesn't ruin your tempo or aggression, and sometimes you just gotta play it as a 3/4 for 4 with Toxic, which is honestly not a bad stat block by itself. As I mentioned, it's starting to see some more love, but I feel like you can still get these around pick 5 or 6. My last tier 2 common is Planar Disruption. Aggro decks want cheap early removal, and there is no better option at common than Planar Disruption. Well, at least in white and green. With removal, there's always a judgment call about whether to use this early, and I've found 3 toughness is the sweet spot for me, since 3 toughness blocks a lot of your early pressure. And since you're aggro, there's more benefit to using it early rather than waiting to hit a target that gains you more value, like you might in Orsov, for example. Since it is removal, you'll want to take this early, around 3 or 4. Now for tier 3. And just in case this is your first time listening to one of my guides, this is where you start to not just want to run as many as you can grab. As I mentioned, Crawling Chorus is a Orsov superstar. In Selesnya, it's just alright. Hitting for Toxic is one of your win conditions, but I think it is secondary to damage. So you don't want a whole bunch of 1 drops that struggle to do damage later in the game. I often end up including 1 or 2 to count towards my 6 1 or 2 drop creatures, so I have early board presence, and Crawling Chorus does match up really nicely against cards like Barbed Batterfist in red if you happen to be racing Boros or red-white. Again, the secret is out on white commons, and these tend to disappear around pick 4 or 5. My next tier 3 common is Titanic Growth. I didn't forget about you, green. In every other green archetype, this card is filler, but I've been really impressed with it in Selesnya, and I'll actively try to include 1 or 2 in my drafting strategy. Again, there's a little bit of judgment that comes in about when to play this card to save a creature or just hit for 4. Think about your future attacks and what they will look like in the following turns. I often see this used as quasi-removal without much thought about whether or not the creature deserves to be removed. Selesnya is aggro after all, and sometimes you just want to get the 4 damage. This is our first card that goes late for a common, and it often wheels. So you don't have to go out of your way to include 1 or 2, and it's a nice payoff for being in Selesnya. My last tier 3 common is Ruthless Predation. I like to play this card early, ideally to remove an opponent's 3 toughness creature. It gets a little sketchy to use this later in the game when your opponent has mana up and can respond for a 2-for-1 with removal. And I really like Ruthless Predation with cards like Flincing Raptor, where you can remove an opponent's blocker and then get in for additional damage as well. It also goes late for removal, around pick 4 or 5. Now for the uncommons. Are you tired of seeing this one? Annex Sentry is tier S in every white archetype. Mythic level uncommon for sure. The tempo swing of removing your opponent's early play can be absolutely devastating, and then it also is a 1/4 that blocks your opponent's early pressure if you find yourself in a race, and it has Toxic itself. It's another crowd favorite from early in the set. This thing is gone by pick 1 or 2, and I think it makes an excellent pack 1 pick 1. My next tier S mythic level uncommon is Ossification. Similar to Planar Disruption, it is excellent early removal, but it exiles the target instead of leaving it on the battlefield, where it can get bounced by an Indoctrination Attendant, or if it has a passive ability, it can continue to affect the board. This card also goes early, around pick 1 or 2, and it makes a great pack 1 pick 1. My last tier S superstar mythic level uncommon for Selesnya is Slaughter Singer. This card is really the reason to be in Selesnya. A 2/2 for 2 with Toxic 2 that gives all of your other toxic creatures +1/+1 when they attack is absolutely great. They get taken at an average rate for an uncommon, around pick 3 or 4, and a contestant in Peeps and Keeps, which is a limited tournament hosted by Isaiah_MTG, managed to pick up 3 in a single draft, and it was an easy trophy indeed. My one and only tier 1 uncommon is Infectious Bite. In other green archetypes, this is usually tier 2 or 3, but in Selesnya, it is fantastic. Removing your opponent's blocker while also giving them a poison counter is exactly what Selesnya wants, and I'll take as many of these as I can get. It being removal and an uncommon, they go early around pick 2 or 3. My first tier 2 uncommon is Hexgold Hoverwings. This card is tier S in Boros because of the 4 Mirrodin equipment synergies, but its second best archetype is Selesnya. Being able to repeatedly give your creature flying is great, and as I've mentioned, I tend to beat and have been beaten by flyers in Selesnya more so than dying to Toxic. It gets picked up around 3 or 4 and is a great inclusion for your Selesnya deck. My next tier 2 uncommon is Viral Spawning, and it is really your only payoff to hitting Corrupted outside of filler like Incisor Glider and Sinew Dancer. Being able to get 2 cards in 1 is great, especially since you tend to have a lower curve in Selesnya and start to run out of gas. But what really sets Viral Spawning so highly is what you can do with toxic creatures, whether it be through pumping it with Slaughter Singer or giving it +1/+1 and flying for a turn with Flincing Raptor. In other green archetypes, the 3/3 has been lackluster for me, even if you plan to hit Corrupted like in Golgari, but in Selesnya, yes please. I'll take as many as I can. However, like many of the cards I've mentioned for this archetype, it goes early around 3 or 4. Next up, we have Kinkerbloom at tier 2. It's better in Golgari and Gruul since it doesn't have Toxic and therefore misses out on the Toxic synergies of Selesnya. But it is still a 3/2 for 2 that can sack to remove a Planar Disruption or Ossification or an enemy's Masticore, or just pop them for a game-winning poison counter. It also goes around pick 3 or 4, so you'll want to grab them when you see them. My last tier 2 uncommon is Tyvar's Stand. The versatility of this card is great in every green archetype. You can use it as a Tamiyo's safekeeping in response to removal for 1 green to save an important creature like Slaughter Singer. You can use it to hit for X damage on an unblocked creature. It also gets taken around 3 or 4, so you'll want to take it early when you see it. And to reiterate from earlier, this is why I think Selesnya was one of my least drafted archetypes. The only card I've mentioned so far that goes late is Titanic Growth, and the only reason to be in Selesnya over, say, something like Orsov or Gruul is Slaughter Singer. My first tier 3 uncommon is Bladed Ambassador. In all the other archetypes, I put Bladed Ambassador as tier 2, and was happy to include as many as I could grab in my deck. I put it at tier 3 in Selesnya for a couple of reasons. First, it doesn't have Toxic, so if you're running Flincing Raptor, it sets yourself up to play Toxic Wind Drake on turn 3. Second, this is better on turn 3, so you have a mana open to give it indestructible, and Selesnya is looking to curve out. So I often find that I don't have the mana available to really make this guy shine. It's still a 3/1 for 2 with upside, and better than filler. But it also goes around pick 3 or 4. My first tier 3 uncommon is Bladed Ambassador. I put it at tier 2 in Orsov because it works nicely with the Offer Immortality combat trick and shines at getting your opponent corrupted quickly. I put it at tier 3 in Selesnya, its second best archetype, because it is still a great target to follow up with the turn 3 Flincing Raptor. But one of the issues I've found with Jawbone Duelist is it becomes too easy to block after turns 3 and 4, so it's better at getting your opponent corrupted than it is at finishing your opponent off. If you can give this card flying with Hexgold Hoverwings and then hit with Titanic Growth or Tyvar's Stand, you can hit for an incredible amount of damage. People love this card though, and it gets picked up super early by pick 2 or 3. My next tier 3 uncommon is Evolving Adaptive, a mythic level uncommon in both Gruul and Simic. It's just alright in the toxic strategies of Selesnya and Golgari. It's easy to get this to be a 3/3 for 1, but because it doesn't have toxic, you miss out on some synergies, and it tends to stop around 3/3, unlike in Gruul or Simic where you can make this card into a monster. It also gets picked up around 2 or 3. My last tier 3 uncommon is Atrax's Skitterfang. Being able to give your creature lifelink can be very important in stabilizing in a race, and one of your win conditions is by getting damage through in the air, so being able to give one of your creatures flying has worked quite well for me. It also gets picked up around 2 or 3. Now for the rares. I'm going to briefly mention Eternal Wanderer. She has the highest win rates in Orzhov and Azorius because of the enter the battlefield effects. You can blink your creatures out. And then White Sun's Twilight, which is best in Azorius because of artifact synergies, but Selesnya is its second best archetype because of toxic synergies. They are both tier S in Selesnya. Thrune, Breaker of Silence, is great in every archetype with green, but nothing special in Selesnya, and I put Thrune at tier 1. Bloated Contaminator, on the other hand, is exactly what Selesnya is all about, dealing damage and toxic at the same time. A 4/4 for 3 with Trample, Toxic 1, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, it proliferates, so it hits for 2 toxic each time it connects. It's at least tier 3 in every green deck, but Selesnya gets the most benefit from the toxic and proliferate, and I put it at tier 1. My first tier 2 rare for Selesnya is Venerated Rotpriest. This card was designed for the Selesnya archetype. It's a 1-drop toxic 1/2 that triggers a poison counter anytime a creature you control becomes the target of a spell. That spell can be either yours or your opponent's. And this works really well in combination with the Fight and Bite green removal spells, since they target one of your creatures. It also benefits off of other combat tricks like Titanic Growth and Tyvar's Stand. But you really need to care about Toxic for this card to be worth running. Its second best archetype is Golgari, for reasons I'll cover in my next video. Now for tier 3, Skrelv's Hive is best in Orzhov, but Selesnya is its second best archetype. There's less of a go-wide strategy like there is in Orzhov, but you are more than likely to hit Corrupted, and giving all of your toxic creatures lifelink can be very difficult to race. Just be careful, since you don't really want to be playing this on turn 2 in Selesnya, since it is bad for your tempo. And I was really torn about whether or not to include this guy in my Selesnya guide. Migloz Maze Crusher is worth splashing. Since you are in an aggressive archetype, you should be careful, since you don't want to screw up your early game plays by choosing to play something like Terramorphic Expanse or Prophetic Prism over curving out and developing the board and applying early pressure. But in green, you do have access to cards like Armored Scrapgorger, which help you splash, and you don't need to worry about getting this guy out on turn 3. It's a 4/4 or a 6/6 or even an 8/8 with Vigilance and Menace, so it can apply plenty of late game pressure and is worth including if given the opportunity. If you do decide to splash for Migloz, cards like Cinder/Ravager, the 5/5 Vigilance that deals 1 damage to your opponent's board and costs less for permanents that have oil counters, is also decent to include. My third tier 3 rare for Selesnya is Skrelv Defector Might. This card is great at protecting your busted creatures like Slaughtersinger. Because of the Phyrexian mana, you can pay life if your mana is all tapped out from playing on curve, and the additional Toxic 1 can stack up on cards like Jawbone Duelist and allow you to hit for 4 poison in a single turn. I usually find myself choosing to hold this back so that it has to be targeted by my opponent's removal, but it has also won me the game by making a creature unblockable if they only have 1 color of creatures left on their board. I'm going to briefly mention Evolved Spinoderm at tier 3, but I find it best in Gruul, where you can give it more oil counters, and Glissa Sunslayer, which is best in Golgari and right on the cusp of whether or not it was worth splashing, since it does perform pretty well in the late game. Mirix is best in Azorius because it is a great way to repeatedly trigger whenever an artifact enters the battlefield ability, but it is also great in Orzhov and Selesnya since it can eventually win you the game by going wide and getting the last couple of poison counters through. It is an even better inclusion if you decide to splash for Migloz or Glissa, since it doesn't enter the battlefield tapped and doesn't screw up your curve. But and then it gives you the option to hold it as a splash. My last tier 3 rare is Melira, the Living Cure. It's slightly better than Filler as a 3/3 for 2, since it can apply early pressure, and limiting the poison counters to 1 can be handy in the mirror match, and being able to sacrifice it to protect something like Basilica Shepherd can be extra spicy, since it triggers the enter the battlefield effect a second time. Now for the mythics. I'll briefly mention Nissa, Ascended Animist. She's tier S in Selesnya and every green archetype, but I find her to be best in Gruul and Simic, where you aim to ramp her out as quickly as possible. Elish Norn, I put at tier 1 and find her best archetype to be Azorius because of the enter the battlefield effects. Tyrannix Rex is worth a mention in more detail. I've settled on Selesnya as Rex's best archetype. I had originally wanted to ramp to it in Simic or Gruul, but what I found is that it wasn't as game-winning as something as like Nissa. In Selesnya, though, your opponent usually has 6 poison counters by turn 7, so it usually wins you the game the turn that it is played. I'll briefly mention Sword of Forge and Frontier at tier 1, but its best archetype is Boros because of the equipment synergies. Zopandrel Hunger Dominus, I put it tier 3, but its best archetype is Simic, and Phyrexian Vindicator, which I put at tier 3 as well, since I tend to be mostly white, similar to Azorius in Selesnya. Last but not least, we have Vorinclex Monstrous Raider. It's a 6/6 trample haste, and if that isn't enough to push lethal through, every time you hit for Toxic 1, you now put 2 toxic counters on instead. So, thank you for enjoying my simple guide to Selesnya. This is the last week before the release of March of the Machines on April 18th, so this week will be a 1 double feature. Tomorrow I'll be covering the last archetype left, Golgari. I hope these guides have helped you enjoy the set as much as I have. I know it wasn't the most popular set, and everyone is eagerly awaiting Mom. Again, a friendly reminder to take a moment to hit like and subscribe. It really helps me out and inspires me to keep making these guides. Thank you all for the support, and I'll see you tomorrow.